Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel. One thing that we talk a lot about here is how fragile our food system is, and when we do that, we tend to focus on supply disruptions caused by man-made events like conflicts or tariffs or other big stuff like natural disasters. But even though those get the most attention, one of the most dangerous long-term threats to our food supply tends to get overlooked, and that's actually declining bee populations. Now, when most folks think about bees, they either think about honey or that time that they got the living mess stung out of them when they were a kid. But the truth is that bees are a lot more important than most people realize. They're responsible for pollinating a huge portion of the food that we eat, everything from fruits and vegetables to also nuts and coffee. And without them, our dinner plates would look a lot different and smaller, although that might not be bad for some of us. And unfortunately, bee populations have been dropping like a rock over the past several years. So today, we're going to talk about why that's happening and what we could be facing if things continue down the path that we're on. Even though they're very small, bees are some of the most important creatures on our planet. They're not like mosquitoes where we can honestly ask ourselves, why? In the United States, around 75% of the produce that we eat is pollinated by bees. Without bees, many of these crops would either completely disappear or become so rare and expensive that only the rich could afford them. And even foods that don't rely directly on bees could still get more expensive because when you start taking large chunks out of the food chain, it's going to increase demand for other foods, which is just going to drive up their price too. And y'all, if you're enjoying this content, then be sure to like, subscribe, and also share the video. Sharing is probably the best thing that you can do to help videos and creators spread out. So if you wouldn't mind considering doing that, I'd really appreciate it. But it isn't just our food supply that would be affected. Bees also play a huge role in maintaining natural ecosystems. They pollinate wild plants that provide food and shelter for wildlife. So if bees were to go the way of the dodo bird, we're not just looking at bare grocery store shelves. We're looking at severe damage to ecosystems, and in a worst case scenario, it could mean things like soil turning into dust bowls and the loss of other animal species that depend on pollinated plants for survival. And once that kind of chain reaction starts, it'd be very difficult to stop. So even if you're someone who doesn't really like honey all that much, doesn't garden, or still holding that grudge for the time that you got the mess stung out of you, it's still important to understand how vital bees are to maintaining our way of life. And unfortunately, bee populations are declining to the point that even non-eco hippie types like me are starting to get a little bit concerned. Like I mentioned a minute ago, over the past year, US beekeepers reported losing over 60% of their colonies, or about 1.1 million, which is pretty stinking bad. Just to put that into perspective, imagine if we were to lose over half of all the cattle, poultry, and produce that we had had from one year to the next. If that were to happen, there would be total chaos. We'd be dealing with food shortages, prices would skyrocket like crazy, and most people would be totally blindsided. We've all seen over the past year how the bird flus cause egg prices to go nuts, and with that, the population of egg-laying chickens was only down like 3% at the end of 2024 compared to the previous year. But it's also important to understand that this isn't a new problem. Bee populations have been going down for decades, but every year it feels like the numbers kind of just keep getting worse and worse. Now, of course, there have been some years where things stabilized a little bit, but overall, the big trend is that things are continuing to go downhill, and this past year's losses were some of the worst that we've seen yet. And it's not just honeybees either. Wild bees, which are critical for pollinating a lot of crops and natural plants as well, they're declining too. Some species could go extinct within the next few decades, and unlike managed hives that you can maybe kind of rebuild over time if you're lucky, once a wild bee species goes away, it's gone for good. Now, just to give you all an idea of what's led up to all this, honeybee numbers in the United States started dropping in the 1940s. After World War II ended, we started changing how we grew crops. We started using large-scale monocultures, which is where one crop is grown in a field at a time. If you've ever driven somewhere and noticed that it seems like there's just miles and miles of cornfields everywhere, that's an example of monoculture. Then we also started using a lot more pesticides than what we had before, and unfortunately, many of those can't tell the difference between a harmful insect that could wipe out a crop and beneficial pollinators like bees. They just go ahead and kill everything just to be safe. But back then, folks weren't really thinking about all that. They were just trying to grow as much food as they could as quickly as possible. There were a lot of new mouths to feed. Baby boomers, and folks were trying to make sure that there was enough food to go around, which is understandable. But then you fast forward to the mid-2000s and things got a lot worse when something called colony collapse disorder, or CCD, began. That's basically when entire hives would die off or disappear with what seemed like no warning at all. But what people found out, though, is that it wasn't just one thing that was causing all of those problems. It was a combination of things, like pests like the Varroa destructor, which feeds on honeybees, viruses, pesticides, and changes in habitat. Bees were kind of getting hit on every side and were struggling to keep up. And since that time, things have been up and down. In some years, beekeepers would report higher survival rates, which were good, but even in those good years, numbers were still down compared to what they used to be. So think of it kind of like a leaky bucket. It may not seem like you've lost a lot of water if you come back and check every couple of minutes, but if you come back to that bucket a day or two later, the difference is going to be a lot more obvious, and that's kind of what's going on with bees. But if things do reach a critical point, it's definitely going to help to have certain things stored at your home. You can find out what you may need by downloading my Ultimate Stockpile Checklist. It's free for anybody who signs up for my newsletter, and you can do that using the link in the description below. Now, you may be wondering, if things are so bad and have been that way for a while, why hasn't everything just totally pooped the bed yet? And the answer to that is that they kind of have. We just haven't really noticed it that much. In places where bee populations have been severely damaged or there's just too many crops for them to keep up with, farmers actually rent bees so that their crops can get pollinated. There are businesses that'll literally load up tractor trailers with beehives and haul them wherever they need to go. They'll park in orchards or fields during bloom season, and then once they're done, they'll pack up the bees and go on to the next farm. We probably wouldn't need to do that if we had healthy bee populations, though, but since people have figured out how to slap a band-aid on the problem, we haven't really noticed it a whole lot when we go to the grocery store. If it wasn't for our farmers and beekeepers solving those issues, we'd be paying a lot more at the grocery store and may not have some of the foods that we're enjoying today. Then, of course, we also import a lot of our food, but those areas are facing issues as well, sometimes worse than we are. Colombia, which produces a lot of the coffee that we use here in the U.S., has been hit particularly hard. And if these problems continue, the solutions that we've come up to deal with them now may not be enough in the future. Many experts are saying that if things continue to go down this path, we could see major food shortages and price increases within the next few years. Notice that I said years and not decades. And once things reach a tipping point, recovering from it is going to be extremely difficult, even if it's even possible in the first place. Because, I mean, you can't just snap your fingers and expect millions of pollinators to just show up again magically. This isn't a stinking Avengers movie. So, while effects may seem small right now, like certain fruits or nuts getting a little more expensive or lower crop yields in some regions, the longer this goes on, the bigger the problems will get. And just like everything else in life, once shortages do hit, folks are going to act shocked, even though the warning signs have been there literally for years. And when things do finally snap, we won't be worried about minor hiccups like having to change from almonds to peanuts. We'll be dealing with some serious long-term mess that could change our entire way of life. First, we'd see some truly significant drops in crop yields. A lot of the foods that we take for granted would become way more difficult to produce in the quantities that we have come to rely on. And the things that we would be able to get would probably be more expensive and might even be lower quality. Then it wouldn't just be our food supply that would be affected. Even crops that get used to feed livestock like alfalfa and clover depend on bee pollination. So maybe you're a living, breathing Ron Swanson that despises anything that isn't meat. You're still going to be affected. Beef, dairy, and other foods will become a lot more expensive and eventually more scarce. Then aside from food production, the economy as a whole would take a huge hit. Agriculture is a massive industry, and if farms start losing yields and money, that's going to ripple out to other things like processing plants, trucking companies, grocery stores, and eventually other seemingly non-connected industries as well. We'll also see problems with more natural food sources as well. Wild plants depend on bees just as much as crops do. If those plants stop reproducing, the animals that rely on them for food and shelter are going to start to decline as well. That means fewer deer, fewer birds, and also small game animals. So this isn't something that we'd be able to hunt our way out of either. And like the declines that we saw in the mid 2000s, there are several reasons why bees are continuing to die off today, and that makes it kind of a difficult problem to solve. First, pesticides are a big issue. In addition to potential health effects that they can have on us, they have been wreaking havoc on bee populations for a long time. Certain types, especially a class called neonicotinoids, are particularly rough on bees. Even if they don't kill them outright, they can mess with their ability to navigate, forage, and reproduce. And the worst part is that a lot of those chemicals are designed to stick around in the environment for a long time, so bees are going to be exposed to it over and over again. Next, there's habitat loss from new construction, even large-scale farming. Bees need a variety of plants to forage from, not just one crop that stretches for miles. When they only have access to one type of crop at a time, it isn't enough to meet their nutritional needs. And remember, whenever I talk about food storage for us, I always like to mention how important it is to have a variety of foods to make sure that our bodies get what they need, and bees are the exact same way. They need a little bit of variety to stay healthy. Then you've got parasites and diseases. The biggest villain here is the varroa mite, which is a tiny parasite that attaches to bees and sucks the life right out of them. They're like little vampires that look sort of like tribbles from Star Trek. Then on top of that, they can also spread viruses that can wipe out entire colonies. So fighting them, it's a full-time job for beekeepers, and even then, sometimes it's just a losing battle. And when you combine all of these problems together with some others that we didn't get to, it just creates a perfect storm for bees to have to deal with. Now, after hearing all this, you might be thinking that I'm just trying to scare the mess out of everybody, but that's not really the case. I think it's important to cover this topic so that A, you know of a potentially big problem that we could face, and B, we can also talk about simple things that we as individuals can do to help, even if it's just a little bit. First, if you have a garden or even just a few flower pots on your back porch, try planting flowers and other plants that bees like. Native wildflowers are some of the best things that you can plant because they're already part of your local bees' diets. And if you're not sure what those are, you can check with local extension offices or even just see what's growing by the side of the road the next time you drive somewhere a little more rural. Then one thing that I'm trying to do in my garden is I'm using less pesticides. I know that doing that can be a big challenge, especially if you're trying to keep hornworms away from eating your tomatoes, little jerks. But even then, there are some things that you can do to reduce how much you have to use. You can use companion planting techniques to help repel different kinds of pests. An example of this would be planting like basil or marigolds near things like tomatoes and peppers. Then if you do have to use pesticides, use those that aren't as harmful to pollinators like acequanocil, and only use them sparingly. Another thing that you can do is provide water sources for your bees. They need water just like everything else, especially during the hotter parts of the year, which we're coming up on. You can set out like a shallow dish with some pebbles in it, and that'll give them a place to land so that they can drink without drowning. And finally, try to support local farmers and beekeepers whenever you can. A lot of the smaller farms use better practices when it comes to protecting pollinators. And then also, you're helping keep local food supplies strong, which is always a good thing if you're into preparedness like we are. That's one thing that our local area had going for us back in the spring of 2020. While a lot of places were running low on different kinds of meat, our local butcher was still able to get people what they needed, and they were able to do that because we have a lot of farmers and ranchers in our area, and they all kind of knew each other. But aside from all that, it's also important to ensure that we have a good buffer supply of food at our home. So, if you want to see the types of food that every prepper should be stockpiling, then click here. Or if you want to see some storage foods that can last for decades, then click here. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.